There are pits in the ground on an island in the middle of Lake Superior, thousands of them. Some are shallow scratches in the dirt. Others go down through solid rock, following veins of pure copper deep into the earth. And nobody living remembers digging a single one. When the first European miners rowed out to Isle Royale in the 1840s, chasing rumours of metal, they thought they were staking fresh claims on untouched wilderness. Then their picks started hitting things that shouldn't have been there. Stone hammers, thousands of them, worn smooth by hands that had gripped them and swung them and dropped them. Charcoal from fires that had gone cold longer ago than anyone could guess. Wooden shovels and levers, preserved in the wet ground like they were waiting to be picked up again. At one site, the miners found something that stopped them cold. A massive chunk of copper, weighing thousands of pounds, sitting on a raised platform of timber. Someone in the ancient past had dug it loose. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Loose, cut and hammered pieces off the top, and jacked the whole enormous mass up onto a wooden cribbing so they could keep working it. Then they had walked off and left it there. The wood was still holding the weight when the 19th century miners rode up and found it. Generations of forest growing over the top. Whoever built that cribbing had planned to come back. They never did. The land had been mined before, long before, and whoever did it had walked away and never come back, leaving the pits open like questions that nobody had bothered to ask for 3,000 years. The 19th century companies that arrived to strike it rich made a strange discovery in the process. Some of the best places to dig, the richest veins, had already been found and marked by people working with stone and fire and patience thousands of years earlier. The ancients had not stumbled around. They had known exactly where the metal was. The Ojibwe who lived along those shores knew about the copper. Of course they did. They had a name for it. They had stories about it too, stories older than the pyramids, by some counts. And buried inside their oldest teachings, the ones passed mouth to mouth across more generations than anyone can properly count, some people believe there is a warning, a prophecy about the ones who took the copper out of the ground, and about the day those miners come back to finish what they started. Tonight we are going to dig into all of it, the ancient mines that mainstream history can barely explain, the staggering amount of metal that some researchers insist simply vanished, and a 4,000-year-old prophecy that a small but growing group of people swear is finally, right now, coming true. Some of what you are about to hear is settled archaeology. Some of it is theory that serious scientists roll their eyes at. Your job is to decide where the line sits, because by the end you might not be sure it sits where you think it does. To understand any of this, you have to go back to the land itself, and to the people who called it home long before the word America existed. The Great Lakes hold about a fifth of all the fresh surface water on the planet. 5 inland seas, carved out by glaciers, ringed by forests that seem to go on forever. To the Anishinaabe, the people the wider world would later call the Ojibwe or the Chippewa, this was not wilderness. It was home. It was Turtle Island, the great land that rose on the back of a turtle after the flood, according to their creation stories. Every river had a name. Every stretch of shoreline held meaning. And running through the rock beneath their feet was something almost no other place on earth possessed: native copper. Not copper ore that has to be melted and refined and coaxed out of stone with high heat. Pure, workable metal, sitting in the ground in chunks and sheets and threads, some of it in nuggets that weighed hundreds of pounds. The Keweenaw Peninsula and the islands of Lake Superior are one of the only places on the planet where copper occurs this way, in this quantity, ready to be shaped almost as it comes out of the earth. The people who first found it did something remarkable with it. They did not smelt it, because they did not need to. They heated it in fires to soften it, then hammered it cold, folding and beating the metal into shape. Spear points, knives, fishhooks, awls, bracelets and beads and heavy ceremonial blades. And the way they got the metal out of the rock in the first place tells you everything about their patience. They did not have iron, CA, or explosives. What they had was fire and water and time. They would build fires against the rock face where a vein of copper ran, heating the stone until it was hot, then throw cold water on it. The sudden shock would crack the rock, weakening it, and then they would go at it with heavy handheld stones, rounded cobbles called mauls, some of them the size of a person's head, pounding the loosened rock away to expose the metal underneath. Then they would work the copper free and start the whole exhausting process again, a few inches deeper. That is how those pits went down through solid rock. Fire, water, and the swing of a stone in someone's tired hands, repeated for thousands of years. The mauls litter the ancient sites by the thousands, cracked and worn out and discarded, each one a record of a day's brutal labour that ended, at most, with a little more copper and a lot of sore arms. Archaeologists gave these people a name, the old copper culture, and when they started running the dates, the numbers stopped making sense. For a long time, the standard story said the old copper people were working the metal around 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. That alone was astonishing, because it made them some of the earliest metal workers anywhere on Earth, right up there with the ancient Near East, in some cases earlier. But then newer studies, pulling radiocarbon dates straight out of the sediment near the old mining sites, pushed the timeline back even further. Some researchers now argue that people were pulling copper out of this ground as far back as 9,000 years ago. 9,000 years. Before Stonehenge. Before the first cities of Mesopotamia. Before writing. And here is the part that keeps people up at night. Sometime around 3,000 years ago, give or take, the mining slowed down and, in many places, simply stopped. The great pits fell silent. The tools were left where they lay. Whatever had driven thousands of people to spend thousands of years hammering copper out of solid rock, it ended. And the archaeological record does not give us a clean reason why. Think about the strangeness of that for a second. This was not a fad. This was an industry that ran for longer than all of recorded history combined. People were born, lived their whole lives, and died working that metal, and their grandchildren did the same, and their grandchildren after that, for thousands of years in an unbroken line. And then it stopped. Not with a war we can find, not with a plague we can trace. It just wound down, quietly, until the pits went cold. Archaeologists have their guesses, and they are reasonable ones. Maybe the climate shifted and moved the people. Maybe the culture changed, and heavy copper tools fell out of fashion as the way people lived and ate and buried their dead evolved. Maybe copper stopped being a practical thing and became a sacred one, mined only in small amounts for ceremony instead of hauled out by the ton. Any of those could be true. Probably some combination of them is. But notice that none of these is a certainty. There is a hole in the story, a genuine gap, and human beings cannot stand a gap. We fill it. Some people fill it with careful maybes. Other people fill it with something much larger. Now, take a breath, because this is where the story splits into two very different roads. Let us walk down the careful road first, the one paved by geologists and archaeologists with trowels and spreadsheets. They will tell you the pits are real. Nobody disputes the pits. On Isle Royale and across the Keweenaw, there are thousands of ancient mining depressions, some of them still holding the stone hammers and charcoal that let us date them. They will tell you the old copper culture was a genuine, sophisticated tradition of indigenous people who understood their land and its metal better than the Europeans, who showed up thousands of years later and were amazed to find the work already done. They will also tell you something that gets left out of the more dramatic versions of this story. That copper did not stay put. It travelled. Copper tools and ornaments made from Lake Superior metal have turned up hundreds and even thousands of miles away, carried along ancient trade routes that stitched the continent together long before Columbus. Pieces of this northern copper have been found in burial mounds in Ohio, in the southeast, down toward the Gulf of Mexico. The Hopewell people, centuries later, built entire ceremonial traditions around exotic materials, and Great Lakes copper was one of the crown jewels of that network. So to the mainstream researcher, there is no mystery about where the copper went. It went where trade takes things, into graves, into ceremonies, into the hands of people far to the south who valued it as something rare and powerful. Hammered thin, worn down, buried, lost, reworked over thousands of years. That is what happens to a precious material over that span of time, and the reach of that trade was genuinely astonishing. Picture it. A piece of metal cut from a nugget on the shore of Lake Superior, passed from hand to hand, community to community, canoe to canoe, down through the heart of the continent, until it ends up as a shimmering ornament in a burial mound 1,000 miles south, laid to rest with someone who probably never saw the lake it came from, and maybe never even heard its name. Copper from these northern mines has been found worked into ceremonial panpipes, into ear ornaments, into sheets beaten so thin they catch the light like foil. This was not a local resource. This was one of the most prized materials in an ancient network that connected peoples across a huge portion of what is now the United States, long before any European set foot here. Case closed, they would say. A remarkable indigenous achievement, well documented, no aliens required, no lost empires, no need for prophecy. But here is where the other road begins, and it starts with a single, explosive number. Somewhere along the way, a handful of researchers and writers looked at the sheer scale of the ancient mining and tried to estimate how much copper had actually been removed from the Lake Superior region over those thousands of years. They looked at the size of the pits, the depth, the number of sites, the volume of rock that had been broken and moved by hand, and the figure they came up with was enormous. Some of them claimed that as much as 500 million pounds of copper had been taken out of the ground, 500 million pounds. Then they asked the question that launched 1,000 theories. If that much copper came out, where is it? The artifacts we have found, the spear points and the beads and the bracelets, all the copper we can actually account for in North American archaeology, they argued, adds up to a tiny fraction of that number, a rounding error. So if the ancients pulled 500 million pounds of metal out of these mines, and only a sliver of it shows up in the graves and the mounds and the museum collections, then the rest of it went somewhere, and it went somewhere else. Somewhere off the continent entirely, they claimed, shipped across an ocean by people who knew exactly what they were doing and left almost no trace of themselves behind. This is the idea that lit the fuse. Because once you accept that premise, that a fortune in metal was mined and then carried away by someone, the door swings wide open. Who were they? Where did the copper go? And why does none of it appear in the story we were taught in school? The theories came fast. Some pointed to ancient Mediterranean seafarers, Phoenicians or their cousins, crossing the Atlantic thousands of years before anyone is supposed to have managed it, running a copper operation on the far side of the world. Some pointed further back and further out, to a lost civilization erased from the record. And in the last decade, one particular version of the theory swallowed all the others and gave them a name: Tartaria. If you have spent any time in the stranger corners of the internet, you have heard the word. The theory of Tartaria says that there was once a vast, advanced, globe-spanning civilization, technologically sophisticated in ways we have supposedly forgotten, that covered much of the world and was then wiped from history, deliberately. Scrubbed out of the textbooks, buried under a so-called Great Reset, its buildings reassigned to other cultures, its achievements handed to more recent hands. The believers point to grand old architecture and say it could not have been built by the people credited with it. They point to strange gaps and resets in the historical record. And they point, more and more often lately, to the copper. To a believer in this theory, the missing metal of Lake Superior is not a puzzle. It is a receipt. Proof that an advanced civilization was here, industrially harvesting resources, on a scale that indigenous stone tool cultures supposedly could not have managed alone, and then shipping the wealth home before the reset swept them away and rewrote the map. And that is where the prophecy comes in. Because if you are looking for evidence that the old miners were real and that they might return, the most powerful witness you could possibly find would be the memory of the people who were actually there, the people who never left. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The Ojibwe. Now I need to be very careful here, and I want you to be careful with me, because this is the exact spot where a good story starts putting words in the mouths of people who never said them. The Anishinaabe do have a prophecy, a real one, sacred, still taught, still alive. It is called the Seven Fires Prophecy, and it is one of the most important teachings in their tradition. But before we let the theorists tell you what it means, let us hear what it actually says. Long ago, the teaching goes, the Anishinaabe lived on the shores of a great salt water in the east, along the Atlantic, and 7 prophets came to them, one after another, each carrying a prediction about the ages to come. Each prophet was a fire, each fire an era. The first prophet told the people they had to leave the coast and journey west, or they would be destroyed. They were told to follow a sacred sign, a vision of a shell rising over the water, the Megis, and to keep moving until they reached a place where food grew on the water. That place, the wild rice country of the Great Lakes, was their destination. So they began one of the longest migrations in the oral history of any people on this continent, moving west over generations, stopping at sacred sites along the way, until they arrived exactly where the prophecy said they would, in the land of the lakes, in the land of the copper. The prophecies continued through the ages. They spoke of times of growth and times of loss. The 4th fire, in most tellings, carried a warning about the arrival of a light-skinned race from across the water, and posed a question the people could not yet answer. Would these newcomers come in the face of brotherhood or in the face of death? The fires that followed spoke of a time of great suffering, of children being taken from their families, of the people nearly losing their language, their songs, their spirit. Anyone who knows the history of what happened to indigenous nations after contact will recognize that this teaching described the future with devastating accuracy. Then comes the 7th fire, and this is the part that matters most. In the time of the 7th fire, the prophecy says, a new people will emerge. Some tellings call them the Ojibwe, the new people. They will retrace their steps. They will go back to the elders, back to the sacred sites, back to the knowledge that was almost lost, and they will try to pick up the fragments that were dropped along the trail. And if they succeed, if enough of the old knowledge can be recovered and the people can find their way back to the right path, then an 8th and final fire will be lit. A fire of peace, of brotherhood, of a world made whole. But there is a fork in that road. The prophecy is not a guarantee. It offers a choice. In the time of the 7th fire, humanity comes to a place where 2 paths lie ahead. One path is worn smooth and green, soft under the feet, the road of respect for the land and for each other. The other path is scorched, blackened, burned by the way we have chosen to live. And the prophecy warns that if the people choose the scorched path, the one paved over and dug up and poisoned, it could mean destruction for everyone. That is the real 7 fires prophecy. Read it again in your mind and notice something. There is nothing in it about copper miners sailing back across the ocean to reclaim their treasure. Nothing about Tartaria. Nothing about a lost industrial empire. It is a far deeper thing than a treasure map. It is a moral teaching, a migration history, and a warning about the choice between greed and respect, delivered by a people who watched almost everything they had be taken from them, and who kept the teaching alive anyway. So how did we get from that to the return of the copper miners? This is where the theorists do their work. They take the genuine prophecy, the fork in the road, the scorched path, the warning about a race coming from across the water, and they graft the copper mystery onto it. They argue that the people who came from across the water in the 4th fire were not only the Europeans everyone assumes. They argue there was an earlier arrival, an older visitor, and that the true meaning hidden inside the teaching is a memory of the ancient miners themselves, the ones who came, took the metal, and left. And they read the scorched path of the 7th fire not just as a moral warning, but as a literal prediction. A prediction that in our own time the diggers would return to the land, the earth would be torn open again, and the choice between the green road and the black road would be forced on all of us at once. And here is the uncomfortable part, the reason this theory has legs. Look at where we are. Right now, at this very moment, the Lake Superior region is at the center of a new mining rush. Copper, nickel, and other metals in that ground are worth more than ever, because the entire modern world, the electric cars, the batteries, the power grids, the devices in your pocket and your hand, runs on exactly the kind of metal those ancient people were pulling out of the earth 9,000 years ago. Companies are filing claims. Pits are being planned near the old sacred sites. Water that the prophecy said would feed the people is now the thing that activists are fighting to protect from contamination. Think about the irony sitting at the center of that. The wild rice, the food that grows on the water, is the exact thing the first prophet told the migrating people to search for. It was the sign that they had reached the promised land at the end of their journey. It is not just food to the Anishinaabe. It is Menumin, the good berry, the reason the whole migration happened in the first place, woven into ceremony and identity and survival. And the new mines planned across that region carry a real risk of leaching sulfides and heavy metals into exactly the watersheds where that rice grows. So the thing the prophecy told them to find, and the thing the prophecy warns could be lost, are now sitting on opposite ends of the same fight. Find the sacred water. Protect the sacred water, from the same metal, 4,000 years apart. The copper miners, in the most literal sense you can imagine, are coming back. And the Anishinaabe, who are standing in front of the bulldozers today, protecting the wild rice waters, are, whether they use these words or not, living inside the exact scenario the seventh fire described. The fork in the road, the green path and the scorched one, the choice. You can see why the theorists feel like they have caught history in the act. They point at the ancient pits and say, someone was here. They point at the missing metal and say, someone took it. They point at the prophecy and say, they told us this would happen. And they point out the window at the new mines and say, look, it is happening now and it is real. It is a powerful story. It has the shape of truth, which is exactly why we have to slow down and pull it apart piece by piece and ask which parts hold and which parts fall away when you put weight on them. Start with that £500 million. It is the load-bearing pillar of the entire theory, so it deserves the most pressure. Where does that number come from? The honest answer is that it comes from very rough estimates made by a small number of writers, some of them working generations ago, extrapolating from the size and spread of the pits. Mainstream archaeologists who have actually surveyed the sites in detail consider it wildly inflated. They point out that many of the so-called pits are natural features, or shallow test digs that never produced much, and that the total volume of copper actually removed, while genuinely large and genuinely impressive, is nowhere near the mountain of metal the theory requires to go missing. Take away the giant number, and the giant mystery it was supposed to prove gets a lot smaller. Then there is the matter of the copper we can account for. The mainstream answer, that it was traded across the continent and worn down and buried over thousands of years, is not a dodge. It is backed by actual copper artifacts found in actual sites across half of North America. The metal did leave the Great Lakes. We can hold the proof in our hands. It just did not leave on a fleet of ancient cargo ships bound for another continent. It left on the backs and in the canoes of traders, one piece at a time, over an unimaginably long stretch of time. And then there is Tartaria itself, which historians and archaeologists do not treat as a suppressed truth, but as a misunderstanding built on an old word. Tartary, on old maps, was simply a vague European label for the huge, poorly understood stretch of Asia that mapmakers could not fill in with detail. It was not the name of a hidden super-civilization. It was the name of a blank space. The theory took a gap in old knowledge and filled it with a lost empire, which, if you think about it, is exactly the same move the prophecy theorists make with the copper. Find a gap. Fill it with something enormous. Here is something worth sitting with, though. The reason theories like this spread is not that the people who believe them are stupid. It is that the official story genuinely does have gaps, and it genuinely did, for a long time, undersell what Indigenous people accomplished on this land. For generations, the schoolbook version of North America before Columbus was a near-empty wilderness of simple hunters, which was a lie, and a convenient one. So when someone comes along and says the textbooks are hiding the truth about ancient advanced peoples in the Great Lakes, Part of that lands because part of it is fair. The books were hiding something. They were hiding the real, documented, extraordinary achievements of the ancestors of the Ojibwe. The theory takes that legitimate grievance and runs off a cliff with it, trading a true hidden history for an invented one, and that is the tragedy of it. The real story was always more than impressive enough. It did not need a lost empire bolted on. So does that settle it? Careful road wins, strange road loses, go home? Not quite. Because even after you strip away the inflated numbers and the lost empires, you are left holding two things that are absolutely real and that are strange enough on their own. The first is the mining itself. However much copper came out, the fact remains that people were extracting and working metal in North America at a time when most of the world was still deep in the Stone Age. That is not fringe. That is the documented achievement of the old copper culture, and it is still not as widely known or as honoured as it should be. The people who did it were not a lost race and not visitors from across the sea. They were the ancestors of the very people who still live there. And that, in a way, is a bigger story than any lost empire, because it is true. The second thing you are left holding is the prophecy. And the eerie thing about the Seven Fires is that you do not need to twist it into a treasure map for it to feel like it is coming true. Read literally as it was actually taught. It already describes a people migrating to a specific land, a devastating arrival from across the water, a near loss of everything, a generation trying to recover what was almost destroyed, and a final choice between a path that respects the earth and a path that burns it. You can argue about how a teaching that old could describe the future that well. You can call it coincidence, or wisdom, or something you do not have a word for, but you cannot honestly call it empty. And right now, in the country of the lakes, the two roads of the seventh fire are not a metaphor. They are a permit application. They are a court case. They are a line of people standing between a drill and a lake. The choice the prophecy described is being made, out loud, in real time, by real people, over the exact same metal that started this whole story thousands and thousands of years ago. So maybe the theorists are right, that the copper miners are returning. They are just wrong about who they are. It was never a lost fleet of ancients sailing back to reclaim their gold. It is us. It is the modern world, hungry for the same metal, walking up to the same ground, facing the same choice the old teaching laid out generations before any of us were born. The pits on Isle Royale are still there. You can visit them. You can stand at the edge of a hole that someone dug with a stone hammer while the pharaohs were still building, and you can look down into the dark and feel how little we actually know about the people who came before. We do not know their names. We do not fully know why they stopped. We only know that they were here, that they were extraordinarily good at what they did, and that they left the land behind for the people who would inherit it. Those people are still here too. That is the part the Lost Empire stories always seem to forget. The Anishinaabe did not vanish. They are one of the largest native nations on the continent today. They were not erased in any reset. They survived the fires the prophecy warned about, every one of them, and they are still keeping the teaching, still telling the story, still standing on the shore of the Great Lake with the copper in the ground beneath their feet. And the teaching says the story is not finished. The eighth fire is not lit yet. Which road we take, the green one or the scorched one, is still being decided, by us, right now, over copper. Maybe that is the real prophecy. Not a date. Not a treasure. Not a hidden empire waiting to sail home. Just a warning, 4,000 years old, that a day would come when we would have to choose between what we want and what the land can survive. And a quiet, patient certainty that when that day arrived, we would recognize it. Look out the window. It arrived.